Your sister asks you to be godmother. Your best friend from college asks you to be godfather. Someone at your parish, gently, at the baptismal font, asks who's been chosen to stand up for this child. And for most Catholic families, the answer comes down to one simple question: who do we love enough to ask? That question feels warm, generous, and completely natural. It's also, quietly, the wrong question to build this decision around, at least not the only one. Godparents were never meant to be simply the people closest to the family. They were meant to be something far more specific and far more consequential than most Catholics realize when that request is actually being made. Maybe you've already chosen godparents for your own children based purely on who felt right in the moment. Maybe you've been asked yourself and said yes without ever fully understanding what you were agreeing to. Maybe you're standing at a font right now, watching someone else make this exact decision, and quietly wondering if anyone actually talked it through beforehand. It's not because love for a person is a bad reason to choose them. It's because a handful of small assumptions, the ones almost nobody explains clearly before the moment arrives, can turn one of the most spiritually significant roles in a child's life into little more than an honorary title. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly 5 dangerous mistakes Christians make choosing godparents, so this decision becomes what the Church actually designed it to be, not simply who you love most, but who can genuinely help carry this child toward heaven. None of these 5 require an uncomfortable confrontation with anyone you love. Every one of them is something you can quietly think through before the next baptism you're asked to be part of, whether you're the one choosing or the one being asked. And most of them can be applied gently, without ever needing to explain to anyone why your thinking has changed. Point 1. Choosing based on family obligation instead of faith. Someone becomes godparent because they're the oldest sibling, because skipping them would cause real tension at Thanksgiving for years to come, because it's simply their turn after they did it for your own child. None of these reasons are cruel or thoughtless in themselves. They're simply not what the role was ever actually built around. The Church is specific about this, even if most families have never heard it stated plainly. A godparent is meant to be someone who actually practices the Catholic faith, who has received their own sacraments of initiation, and who can genuinely model and support that child's spiritual life over decades, not simply someone who's next in line by family logic. This doesn't mean the person needs to be a theologian or a daily mass attendee with a perfect record. It means the honest question isn't only, who do we love? But who is actually living this faith in a way that could guide a child toward it? There's a real difference between someone who checks the box of being Catholic on paper, baptized decades ago, and never really engaged since, and someone actively living out that faith today, imperfectly perhaps, but genuinely. The role was designed with the second kind of person in mind, even when family logic quietly points toward the first. Before your next baptism, try asking yourselves this question together as parents. If this godparent were the only Catholic influence in our child's life for an entire year, would that be enough? It's an uncomfortable question. It's also exactly the one the Church is quietly asking you to consider. Think about the difference between someone who would show up warmly to every family gathering and someone who would actually notice, 10 years from now, if that child quietly stopped going to Mass and would care enough to gently ask why. Both people might love your family equally. Only one of them is actually equipped for what this specific role requires. The next mistake is even easier to make, because it happens with the very best intentions. Point 2. Choosing to honor someone rather than to equip the child. A grandmother who would be heartbroken if skipped. A godparent from your own baptism decades earlier, now asked to return the favor for your child. A close friend going through a hard season who could genuinely use the honor. Every one of these reasons comes from real love. None of them actually asks whether this person is equipped for what the role requires. Godparent isn't meant to function primarily as an honorary title, a way of saying thank you or including someone in a meaningful family moment. It's meant to be a real, working spiritual commitment, someone who prays for this child by name for the rest of their life. Who steps in if faith formation falters at home, who takes actual responsibility, not simply attends the ceremony and appears in the photographs afterward. This is genuinely hard to sit with, because saying no to someone you love or choosing someone else instead can feel like a rejection, even when it isn't one. But the child at the center of this decision deserves a godparent chosen for what they can actually offer, not simply for who might feel hurt by being passed over. If honoring someone still matters deeply to your family, and it often should, consider other meaningful ways to include them in the day itself. A special reading, a blessing, a role in the celebration afterward, separate from the specific spiritual responsibility of godparent itself. This isn't about withholding love or recognition from someone who deserves it. It's about recognizing that honoring someone and equipping a child spiritually are two different gifts, and a family can offer both without collapsing them into the same single decision. If that one felt uncomfortably close to home, the next one is something most Catholic parents have simply never been told. Point 3. Not verifying the person actually meets the church's requirements. Many families choose a godparent, plan the entire day around them, and only discover at the parish office, sometimes just days before the baptism itself, that the person doesn't actually meet the church's basic requirements for the role. This creates real stress at exactly the wrong moment, entirely avoidable with one simple conversation weeks earlier. The requirements are specific. A godparent must be a confirmed, practicing Catholic who has received the Eucharist, must be at least 16 years old in most dioceses, and cannot be the biological parent of the child. If married, that marriage generally needs to be recognized by the church. A baptized, non-Catholic Christian can sometimes serve as a Christian witness alongside a Catholic godparent, but not replace the Catholic godparent's role entirely. Before you ask anyone, or before you accept if you're the one being asked, have one honest, direct conversation with your parish office first. A 5-minute phone call weeks in advance prevents a painful surprise days before the baptism and gives everyone involved time to adjust gracefully if needed. This requirement isn't the church being unnecessarily strict or bureaucratic. A godparent is asked to make real promises during the baptism itself, promises about faith, and practice that only makes sense if the person making them is actually living that faith. Skipping this check doesn't make those promises optional. It simply means they're being made by someone who may not be able to keep them. If you discover partway through planning that your first choice doesn't meet the requirements, that's not a failure or an embarrassment. It happens to many families, and most parish offices have seen it many times before. There's almost always a graceful path forward, whether that means choosing a different godparent or including the original person as a Christian witness alongside a qualifying Catholic sponsor. And that leads into a mistake many families make even after choosing well, one that happens quietly, years after the actual ceremony. Point 4. Treating the role as finished the moment the ceremony ends. The baptism happens, there are photos, a celebration afterward, and for many godparents, that's essentially where active involvement ends. A card on birthdays, maybe a gift at confirmation years later, but no real ongoing spiritual presence in that child's life at all. The role was never meant to conclude when the water touched that child's head. It's meant to be a lifelong spiritual commitment, someone praying for this specific child by name regularly. Someone who notices if faith seems to be fading as they grow older. Someone willing to have a real conversation about God with a teenager who might not want to hear it from their own parents. Many godparents genuinely intend to stay involved and simply lose track over the years. Life gets busy, distance grows, and the role quietly fades from an active commitment into a distant memory attached mainly to a single photograph from the day itself. If you're a godparent who hasn't thought about this role in years, that's incredibly common, and it's never too late to re-engage. A simple text on that child's baptism anniversary, a genuine question about how their faith is going during a visit home. Small, consistent gestures do more over decades than any single grand moment ever could. Think about the godparents who show up quietly and consistently across an entire childhood. The ones who remember a confirmation date without being reminded. who ask a genuine question about faith during a holiday visit instead of only talking about school or sports. Those small, repeated moments accumulate into something far more significant than any single gift or card ever could, and they cost very little beyond simply remembering to show up. If distance or circumstance has made in-person involvement difficult, a regular note, a phone call around meaningful dates, or simply keeping that child's name in daily prayer are all real, legitimate ways to remain spiritually present, even from far away. Now, here's the final one, and it's less about the choosing itself and more about what happens after that choice is made. Point 5. Never actually talking about what the role requires. The person genuinely says yes, everyone is happy, and the conversation simply ends there. Nobody actually discusses what being godparent means in practice, what's genuinely expected over the coming years, or what the family hopes this person will actually do beyond standing at the font that day. This leaves everyone quietly guessing about what actually comes next. The godparent assumes showing up to the ceremony itself was the primary commitment expected of them. The parents assume the godparent already understands they're expected to be praying regularly and staying spiritually present in the years ahead. Nobody's wrong exactly, but nobody's actually on the same page either. And the child at the center of it all is the one who ultimately experiences the gap between those two quiet assumptions. A short, honest conversation before the baptism, even just 15 minutes, changes this completely. Simply ask directly, what does being godparent mean to you? And here's what it would mean to us. It doesn't need to be formal or awkward. It only needs to happen at all, instead of being quietly assumed and never actually said out loud. Some families find it helpful to write down 2 or 3 specific hopes beforehand. Things like praying for the child by name, being present for major sacraments, or being someone the child could reach out to as a teenager, and simply sharing that short list with the godparent as a starting point rather than a rigid contract. It turns a vague honor into a real, shared understanding both people can actually act on. This same conversation is worth having even years later if it was never had at the time. It's genuinely never too late to sit down with a godparent, even one chosen 20 years ago, and ask honestly what the role has meant so far and what it could still become. Before you go, let's bring this decision before God together. Lord, you entrusted the raising of children to real people, not simply to good intentions or family obligation. Give parents the wisdom to choose godparents who can genuinely walk with our children toward you, even when that choice is difficult. Give godparents the courage to take this role seriously, long after the ceremony ends and the photographs are put away. Help every family have the honest conversations they've been quietly avoiding about what this role truly asks of everyone involved. And for those of us who already said yes to this role years ago without fully understanding it, give us the grace to begin again today, one small, faithful gesture at a time. Amen. If even one of these 5 felt uncomfortably familiar, that's not meant to make you regret a choice already made. It's meant to help you make the next one more intentionally, or to re-engage with a role you already carry. You don't need to fix all 5 at once. Even one honest conversation, one renewed commitment to actually pray for that child by name, changes what this role becomes going forward. Small, consistent faithfulness over many years will always matter more than a single perfect decision made at the font. Subscribe for more honest, practical Catholic teaching like this. And in the comments below, tell me if you're a godparent and how you've stayed involved in that child's faith over the years. Next time, we're looking at the quiet mistakes Christians make at their child's baptism itself, the day this whole role actually begins.